Hey guys, it's another awesome weekend of cybersecurity training with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. And today we intend to guide you on how to properly install certain softwares, which are very essential for you to perform the use of containers such as Docker on your computer system. And most importantly, walk you through the steps on how to go about installing softwares, especially if you're trying to get applications running on the organization's on-premise infrastructure, or in this case, if you're a red teamer and you intend to, pen test on the client site, you have to make sure that whatever you do, you don't end up installing a software that will end up becoming a bug, to now spiral across the network and compromise the infrastructure of the client. So for today, it's not a penetration testing training, and also it's not a red teaming tool. It's just a general cybersecurity tool, which is trending or which is well known right now, which everyone is, trying to get on board to use on the Windows environment. So today it's going to be a very short video, not going to take much of your time. And at the end of the day, when we're done, you should be able to understand how to install these various softwares or applications, which are very essential for your day-to-day activities as a cybersecurity professional. So on today's training, we are going to walk you through on how to install the WSL, which is the Windows Subsystem for Linux, and how to also install the Docker container, the GUI version, on a Windows environment or Windows machine. So basically, Docker, as we all know, it's a containerization application and a very good way to interact with containers, both the ones you develop as a developer yourself or the ones that were created by other software developers out there who intend to push applications out for various users to use depending on the jurisdiction, or should we say the categories of their profession as an IT personnel. So it's been trending when it comes to WSL, and most people quite, have a lot of videos out there on how to install this. But before you install WSL, you should first of all understand how and what is the most important part of WSL you need to install. Okay? So when you go to the official Microsoft website, you will be able to notice that Microsoft gave a command on how to install the WSL. But that is also complicated because when you use the command to install WSL, it's just going to install all the various versions of WSL out there on your system. And the impact on this is that, first of all, it's going to take a lot of storage space on your machine. And secondly, it's going to be a complicated situation whereby you install various versions of the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which you do not intend to use. Also, going through the Microsoft Store to install WSL, you can see that there are a lot of developers out there who have pushed various versions of this application. Okay? But what is the downside to that is that when you install those versions from the Microsoft Store, there is a possibility that you might install an application that is not, going to be maintained over time, and not just being maintained over time. You also cannot trust the developer of this various version of the WSL. Like we all know that there has been cases whereby trusted personnel have released package in the past, when it comes to GitHub repositories. And it was later found out that these packages were crypto miners and had malwares in them. Okay. So in as much as Microsoft, tends to manage its store, we cannot ascertain that they can be 100% correct. Okay. In as much as they do, state on the platform as well, that whatever you purchase from the Microsoft Store is very safe. But we all know that even the operating system itself over time always has a bug. So how much more when it comes to software or applications which you are downloading from the store, can be safe to install or use on your operating system. So this made us to go deep down the rabbit hole just to put in one or two things together, and of course, guide you on how you can install safe applications and teach you the concept of how to, in most cases, consider certain applications from the source, or should we say from the rightful developer, than relying on applications from Microsoft Store. Okay, so with that being said, we would be walking you through that and showing you how to install WSL, how to set up the configurations, and of course, installing the Docker GUI, which is also a very interactive application when it comes to dealing with containers on a Windows environment. Over here, these are the two links which are very necessary for you to download the various applications which we'll be dealing on today. So the first link deals with you downloading the desktop version of WSL, which has the blue Ubuntu icon, and of course, the version with the architecture name, which we are using, in this case, our operating system. So if you do not know how to check your system architecture, I think there are a few MSC commands you can run on PowerShell, and you can get this information. Okay, so that is out of scope because we're not doing an in-depth training today, just basic installation. Then secondly, for the Docker desktop version, there are various versions of the software on the official website. You can download for Mac, you can download for Mac Silicon based and Intel chip. You can also download for Windows, in this case AMD 64/Intel or ARM 64, depending once again on the architecture of your Windows environment. And lastly, we also have the GUI version for the Linux environment. So in this case, you can install on Kali, you can install on Ubuntu, and so on. Okay. Now you can see on the icon of the installers, we placed an arrow and gave a directive of which application comes first. So first of all, before you install the Docker for desktop, it is advisable to install the WSL first. You might be wondering why. Okay. So in our last training, we talked about how to set up ELK, which is the Elasticsearch, and Kubernetes. Okay. And during the process of the installation, there were instances where we needed to generate tokens and create passwords that are required to use ELK on Docker containers, right? So what did we do? We had to spawn the WSL to access the directory where we can generate these tokens and password. And from there, we carried out the various command prompts and generated these credentials, which we now use to sign in into the ELK applications. So imagine if we had installed Docker before we installed the WSL. This is going to be quite a complication, right? So that's why it's important that before you install Docker for desktop on Windows environment, first of all, try and install the Ubuntu or WSL. Then after you're done, you now proceed to install the Docker. Okay. So we already downloaded these installers, and we'll just show you a quick overview on how to do, the installation. Here we have the Docker installer and we have the WSL for, Windows environment. And also we have installed this, and we do not intend to uninstall it because you can see here we have the Linux. And if we click on it, you can see we have various versions of Ubuntu. We have the Ubuntu, we have the 24.04, which is the latest one. Okay. So notwithstanding, if you want to install, you just come here, you double click. So usually this installation will take a few minutes or seconds. And yes, we decided to install on the music directory just to make sure we don't complicate certain things. Okay. So you can see here, it says error already exists, right? So we can just press enter. Okay. Now, after installing, there are two things you have. You have the WSL itself to launch the terminal, and you have the settings. Okay. So for the settings, you just click on the settings. This you can get through the search bar. Then on the memory and processor, for ours, we are using 8, okay, because we have a lot of processor speed and so on. Then for the RAM also, we have over 64 GB, so we are using half of our RAM. And for swap size, we are using 8 GB, okay. Then we go to file system, okay. You can see we are using the default max size of virtual hard disk. So this is like almost 1 terabyte, okay. This is the expansion we want it to be, almost 1 terabyte, okay. So you can resize, you can put and reset size if you want to, okay. Then on the networking, this is where the configuration comes in. So for networking, we can either use a NAT network. And if you've been following our various trainings, you can notice, or you will notice, that the reason why we always advise to use NAT is because we don't want to, reveal our actual IP address to the public internet. So in this case, we are talking about our private IP address. Okay. Then secondly, we decided to also enable the Hyper-V firewall. So in case there is a compromise, we can be able to block those connections from intruding into our network. Okay. So here we have, ignored ports. You can put ports you want to ignore here, but we have none here. So you can see here we have the localhost forwarding. Okay. It's on. So host address loopback, we turn this off. You can decide to put it. Auto proxy enabled, of course, you have to put it on. And DNS proxy enabled, also you have to put it on. And of course, DNS tunneling enabled, you also have to put it on. Then for this one, I usually don't set this one on, just leave it off. Then for optional features, okay, you enable the GUI application version. It's very important you do. So enable nested visualization, also put it. Safe mode, I do not put this. Okay, I don't want to run it on safe mode. And also this one also for enable sparse VHD by default, also turn it off. Okay. Now, once you're done with this, the next thing you want to do is to now install Docker. Okay, remember the WSL has 2 icons. We have the WSL itself to launch the terminal and the WSL settings to do our configuration. So if we launch this right now, you can see we have the WSL here. And if we just strike enter on our keyboard, everything should be fine. Okay, so because we've done the installation previously, it's now telling us to create an account. So once you run this, the first thing you need to do is just set up an account. So you can just say FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY or your own username, and you hit enter. Then you set up a password and you type the password. And as you can see, it's going to tell you that this has been set up, and every other gibberish message is here. Okay. So that's how you set this up. Very easy, straightforward. And remember, don't download from Microsoft Store or any third party. Just go straight to Ubuntu and download this version. Okay. So once we're done, the next thing we want to do is we want to install Docker. So how do we install Docker? We just click on this. You can either run as administrator or just like a normal installer. Then you click yes. Then you're going to see something like this. Add the shortcut to desktop, of course. Okay. Then everything else will be, unpacked. These are all the necessary files that are very essential for Docker to function on your PC. Okay. Also, one of the major criteria why we advise you not to install any other version of WSL, such as Kali, is because we all know that Kali always release a rolling update, right? So this rolling update always release, from time to time, and they are basically patched like almost every few days. Kali would advise you to run the sudo apt-get update and upgrade -y to, run upgradable packages or new updates that were released. Whereas for Ubuntu provides the long-term support, okay? And not just the long-term support, is that Ubuntu is widely used for various IT infrastructure services such as, deploying servers, hosting web applications, and more. So because of this adoption, maintaining the Ubuntu version of WSL is stable compared to other versions of, Linuxes. Okay. So it's advisable to follow this link as we have advised you, and to get this application from the official Ubuntu's website, and of course, install and do the necessary configuration as described on our screen. Now our installation is complete. We can now close. Okay. Now, once we close, the next thing we want to do is I want to search for Docker. So when you install the Docker, the first launching, you have to run as an administrator. Okay. And you say yes. This might take some time, but just give it a while. It's going to come up. Now, you can see here, there are a lot of documentations that has to do with subscription service and so on. You just click accept and wait for a while. Okay. Now, after you accept the terms and agreement of services, you should see a GUI version like this to log in via your work or personal. So in our case, we use the work email. You log in and you continue. Okay. So when you click on this and put the email, it's going to pop out your browser for you to log in and provide your email and password again. And once it's connected on the browser level, it's going to tell you to launch the application on your desktop. Okay. So once again, remember, it is very important to follow the order of installation. Okay. First of all, you install the WSL, download it from official Ubuntu. Then after that is done, you now install Docker for desktop, which is also downloaded from official Docker website. Okay. And once that is done, you can now basically sign in or sign up if you don't have an account on Docker's official website, log into these containers and do some special configurations and proceed to run various Docker commands that needs you to pull containers from official website of these various organizations that, have these containers deployed out there for you to download into your PC locally. Okay. So that will be all for this week. Okay. It's very easy. There's nothing much to be done. And try and practice. Okay. These are very important that you know this strategy and this concept, because if you don't have this idea, you technically don't have an idea to do hands-on. Okay. So understand how things are done and the orderliness. Okay. Everything in cybersecurity, is it red teaming, blue teaming, whatever role you find yourself, you should have a structure. This also gives you a sound mind and of course a proper how do I put it? A proper concept on how you handle your task, to get the appropriate results or outcome, to present in a very neat and orderly manner to the various higher ups, or let's say stakeholders, whenever you have, something to explain or to convey to them. So that will be all for this week. Do not forget to leave a like, subscribe, drop those awesome comments. We see them and we appreciate them. And we do also reply those comments by either giving a heart, a like, and of course, recommending more efforts by replying you and giving you some words of encouragement. And also remember to share with your friends. Until next time, see you and bye for now.